Good morning. Welcome to our Dockside chat. This morning, we're going to be sitting down with Paul Sells from ABS Wavesight to talk about the carbon intensity indicator. So before we do that, I'd like to just dive in a little bit more on what we mean by that and create a little bit of a framework for the conversation. So carbon intensity indicator or CII is really a metric that measures emissions per unit of distance. If you look at the equations, there's always a dead weight tonnage or a gross tonnage in there as well, but it's technically just a constant, and it doesn't really matter for like the dynamics of the parameter. And so what we're measuring really is like how much CO2 is emitted per unit of distance. And that means that basically if you're moving or not makes a big difference. If you're sitting in port, your distance is going to be zero, so your denominator is going to be zero. So speed matters. And if you look at the equation, you can actually kind of see how much speed matters because CO2 emissions is basically your consumption, fuel consumption, which scales as the speed cubed, and distance is the amount of time spent at sea. Multiply it by speed, so that is v. And if you say v cubed over v, that means that the CII metric scales as v squared. And so basically that means if you go a little bit faster, it's going to hurt your CI quite a bit. If you go slower, you're going to have a pretty big impact on your CI as well. So really it shows a strong dependency of speed, which is not a surprise. And if you look at for a typical capesize, this is roughly what that looks like in terms of CI. So on the horizontal axis here, you see speed, and the vertical is the CII score attained, not normalized. And so a couple of things you can see. There's a strong dependency on speed. If you look at what the slope of that line looks like, you can, in ranges that are sort of like typical for vessels like this, say, from 11 to 13, if you estimate the slope there, it's about 0.3 points of CII per knot. And if you look at the range going from A to E, you really only have like 0.9 points to go. So, 3 knots is the difference between scoring an A or an E. And so it's a big jump, and that dependency is real. The other dependency, obviously, that's there is weather. If you make this same plot, but now add a Beaufort 6, relationship, you can see that you move the whole line up, and you're operating in a very different regime. So both speed selection and weather impacts are going to greatly impact your CI score, and that sort of like brings it almost to voyage optimization, if you will, where you take weather as sort of its resistance factor into account and trying to optimize the economics. So the only question really remaining that is a really important part of CIs is the economic question. Like, what is the value of CII? To give you an example of what that means and how we could think about that is we'll consider a capesize with a $30,000 day rate, and we'll assume that bunker price is $450 a metric ton. And the numbers really don't matter. If you up the day rate, basically means you're just going to move a little faster because of your optimum speed. And if you increase your fuel price, you'll be slowing down if you want to optimize basically your outcomes. But one way to think about this is cost per nautical mile. So in the figure here, the red line is the fuel cost per nautical mile. And that increases as you go faster because obviously if you move faster, you're going to spend more fuel per nautical mile. On the other side is the opportunity cost, so the cost of time. If you spend more time on the water, it will increase. And so going fast will actually reduce your opportunity cost. What you really want to look at is the sum of the two. Your total voyage cost is the cost of your opportunity cost, so your time spent on the water, you're not doing something else. And the fuel cost, which is really the fuel you're burning to try to reduce that opportunity cost. And that's the green line. And what we're looking for is where the green line is a minimum. That is basically the balance between opportunity costs and fuel costs in the most optimal sense, and it's the most economic speed to be traveling at. If you zoom in on that a little bit, you can see that if you're adjusting your speed for CII, the implications can be quite large. Just an example here, if you drop by almost 2 knots, to maybe meet a CII requirement, you're actually going to be spending about $5 a nautical mile extra. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you are traveling 60,000 miles a year, then that would be $300,000. So there are real economic decisions to be made, and questions around like, one, how do we set the value of CI, and how do we translate that into voyage optimization constraint is a real one. And so if you think about, the idea of like optimum speed, which is obviously from a voyage optimization perspective limited, but it's relevant nonetheless for like just understanding the relevance of understanding the value of CII. So what we're really trying to do in voyage optimization on a voyage level, which is, on a time scale of like 30, 40 days, say, for a longer voyage, and could be, shorter than that, obviously. We're trying to maximize the earnings of the vessel overall, which means that we minimize total voyage costs, and we do that dynamically. It's not like we're setting an optimum speed. We really want to calculate the actual cost of the voyage, brute force through millions of options and figure out what's the most economical one. However, now, in addition to, voyage costs of all sorts, time costs, we're now adding a fuel cost, which is sort of added in a unusual way. CII is basically a fuel cost, but because of its tiered nature, and the difference in timescale, this is now an annual timescale versus a voyage timescale, it's a very unusual way of adding that, and it's not as simple as just adding a fuel tax. And so the challenge is that we have to deal with a metric which operates or impacts the optimization in an unusual way, and we have to combine timescales. And with those timescales come uncertainties. Obviously, the longer the timescale, the greater the uncertainties around market variables, the performance of the vessel, et cetera. And those are the challenges that we have to overcome. So if you think about how voyage optimization ties to CII, one way to think about it is like a multiple scale optimization paradigm, where basically on the one hand, we say, hey, we have these annual targets we want to hit, either by knowing the delta in cost between, say, A, B, C, D, E, or a specific target, like we want to hit a B for this specific vessel. Now we have to translate that back to what we're supposed to do for an individual voyage to execute against that target in the most economic sense, so the most profitable way. And so what we have to overcome there is basically the challenge of uncertainty around forward models for market variables like fuel, market rates. We need to know where the vessel is operating, in what time of year, because that will dictate weather. We need to know distribution between port and sea days, which not only impacts our CII directly, but also obviously will impact the fouling rate of the vessel and therefore its overall performance, et cetera. So tying those things together is a challenge. And I think 2023 really is an opportunity for organizations to think through how to best implement this into their workflows, and get a better handle on the sensitivities of these models and how do they impact the outcomes and the data density and quality that's available within the organization to make sure that you're able to get the benefits of these types of multiple scale optimizations going forward. So with that, I'm going to leave it here, and we're going to go over to our dockside chat with Paul Sells, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. All right. Today we're going to be talking about the challenges of navigating towards a carbon neutral future, particularly the ambitious goals of 70% reduction in CO2 by 2050. How do we get there? What are the tools? How do we use them? So there's lots of different things that are in flight right now. I mean, as a whole, the industry is in revolution mode in many ways. But one of the operational aspects is CII, carbon intensity indicator, which is going to be something that everybody's thinking about, working on, how to deal with it, how to implement this effectively, not only from like, hey, can I meet my measuring and reporting requirements, but how do I optimize it, or how do I optimize for it as a business? And so I'd love to hear from you, Paul. Like, what have you seen with customers and partners and folks in the industry? Like, what is the thinking? Like, what are the challenges people have identified, and how are they dealing with it?
Oh, thanks, Tim, and thanks for having me here today for our little talk here.
Yeah, hey,
happy to be here and share some thoughts with everyone. So from our perspective, we're dealing mostly with owners and with some charters as well The thing that everybody's been looking at January 1st, 2023 for the beginning of these regulations. I think everybody would agree that no regulation is perfect, and it's going to take a little time for to get some of the kinks worked out. But there are a lot of companies that are really aggressively looking at how am I doing today, and how am I starting to measure not only my my consumption but my emissions as well. And as some of those items start to resolve around the regulatory framework, the thing that is not going to change is you need the visibility into how are you doing so that you can make decisions going forward. So I clearly didn't make this up, but there's an old saying that what gets measured gets managed, and if you're not measuring it, it's not going to get managed regardless. So so the things that people are asking about are, what are some of the best ways that I can accumulate or capture my data and measure my CII across all of my vessels, across all of my voyages. And what's not unique to anyone is that their perspective is limited by where they sit. So if I'm an owner, I may operate my business in a particularly, a way that we've done it for a long time that makes total sense for me and meets all of my business objectives, whereas another owner with a similar fleet may have some slight nuances on that, on some of the fundamentals in terms of how am I measuring my voyages, how am I demarking where my voyages begin and end. All of these little nuances have served owners well for a long time, but when it comes to responding to a big industry challenge like an emerging regulation, there's a lot of little hard points about bringing all that together. So yeah, that's where everybody is starting or needs to be starting.
And obviously as a metric, I mean, something like this is a complicated thing to do in general, and to get it right across the board is hard. And everybody knows that CII as a metric is in many ways will have unintended side effects. And to your point, like basically, some things we don't know, like how are they going to evolve and change, and some things we do. Like it is likely that CII is going to evolve. Sort of like right now it's in emissions per unit distance, which will have side effects around like, well, then keep moving instead of sitting still.
Sure.
And that's really not what we want.
Right.
But so I think one of the opportunities is that despite the fact that the metric will likely evolve and change, the idea, the concept of paying for emissions, or like there is some consequence to emissions, is going to stay. And the fact that we have to figure out ways of how do we measure and report on those, and how do we as a business optimize to make sure that we're getting the best possible outcomes in the most profitable way, that's something that's not going to go away. And in many ways, this is an opportunity this year to learn how to deal with this. Like this is the first year that we actually have to execute on it, and it's an opportunity for all of us to learn like how to best do that. Like what are the tools that we need? How can we learn to optimize for it? What is the cost of CII? Like it's one of the big questions I think we've faced a lot. Like okay, we'd love to minimize or maximize our score of our vessel, but how much is it worth to us? Like, what is the cost of it? Have you seen that in people you've talked to?
I absolutely have, and the thought that people are bringing to it is somewhat in response to what they know now, and somewhat in response to where they're anticipating the market may go. And so the things that we know now are about CII and the published consequences. The things that we don't know in the future, but we're pretty sure they're going to go that direction, are things like carbon emission tax, or the cost of carbon and some other mechanism that shows up to the operator, to the owner, to the charter. So regardless of where that lands in the future, wrapping your arms around where am I today is the most important thing as you plan your strategy forward, going into this world of net zero as we target it.
Yeah. What about urgency? So obviously, as humanity, we're in a hurry. But an industry has to adapt. I mean, it costs money, it takes time. How do you feel, and have you been to conversations with others around like, why now? Like, how fast should we move? Like, what is maybe too fast to break it, or like, is this year the right year to like really start focusing on this? Should you be thinking about this? Like, what is sort of like the things you've encountered?
Well, I think unfortunately, if you start where you are, but if you're just starting to think about it right now, you're a little bit behind. the regulations are on us. They began January 1st.
Yeah.
When push comes to shove and the teeth start showing up here in the months and years to come, obviously that still remains to be seen how that's going to play out. But the more informed you are, the better you are going into that discussion, and also the better informed you are to build the strategy for your business and plan contingencies for how that future may play out.
Yeah.
So if the cost of that carbon, the cost from the regulatory perspective might be one thing, but the ways that an owner would respond to improving the emissions profile of their vessel includes a spectrum of responses. Everything from where we generally talk about it with digitalization and monitoring and measuring, and then using those digital tools to do things like improve vessel performance or improve the way that the voyage, the way the ship navigates on its voyage dynamically, are some really great places to start. But there are some other more expensive areas, of course, with energy improvement devices or alternative fuels, all these things in the future that are, and it's going to take everything to sort of get there, right?
Totally.
But regardless of what one's choice is with an existing fleet right now, it's hard to deny that beginning to measure is kind of the starting point. Yeah, it's step one. You don't know where the journey is going to end, but you know where the first step is.
And you need to have the data and the numbers to see where you're tracking. So it's going to foundationally change things in the industry. As an owner, you're no longer disconnected from a charterer who operates your vessel. This is obviously a challenge that I think we're all facing now. Like, how do we deal with that? And love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, what is sort of like, how do you see this evolve going forward? What do we see right now? Like, how are people thinking about that? How can we work in a world where we time charter out vessels and still operate in a way that is sort of like sensible from a CII perspective, given all the uncertainties that we have, just generally about like what is the cost of CII and what is the best way to operate with CII being a real thing. How do we deal with that? Like, what is the future there?
What is the future of CII?
Well, in light of like the relationship between owner and time charter.
Oh man, yeah, that's it introduces a whole new dimension into that conversation, right? For eons or however long, the parameters of a time charter have been a few things, and now there is a little bit more amorphously defined economic impact to the vessel owner, that shows up with the CII. So if I'm an owner and I give you my ship and you take goods from point A to point B and you do it through rough seas and flat out, that has a significant impact.
And lasting too.
A lasting impact on absolutely on the ability of my vessel to take future charters or to be sold or to be just whatever I would consider in the future.
Yep.
And so to have that not be such an asymmetrical relationship where there is where either I have all the information or the charterer has all the information, it's not a good place to start. And it can be improved. It can be improved by not trying to do sort of everything all at once, but putting a strategy together to both collectively sort of look at who's the honest broker of my data, essentially.
Totally.
Yeah.
And this is an opportunity too, right? I mean, this is an opportunity to change the way we do business, and I think the role of digitization in that can be profound, in the sense of basically like better data transparency, the ability to store and share data, more in a more agile way.
Mm-hmm.
So in many ways, with that, I think the role of digitization may be amplified. How do you see digitization strategies being sort of like changed and maybe redirected, in light of like CII, maybe sort of like the complexity of CII in sort of like the charter relationship? What are sort of like ongoing things that you've seen there?
Oh, a very fundamental thing we've seen is a realization that data is going to have uses beyond its immediate perceived use, or the reason we put it in place right now. Yeah. Let's take an example like data off of the vessel, right? Like some vessels are very highly instrumented and can give you their status, their remaining on board, sort of everything in the kitchen sink through a really well-oiled API that an owner is invested in. On one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, it's static, it's unstructured, it's a noon report. It's just here's where we were, here's what was on board, to the best of my ability to determine as a master. But that snapshot is not necessarily. It serves its purpose. It serves its purpose and the reason it was put in place and the reason that it has to be managed that way.
Yeah.
But looking a little bit around the corner at how I'm going to take that unstructured information and be able to derive more decision-making capabilities out of it, it is really a place where a lot of people are thinking right now. So I used to receive an email and I would know what kind of was going on with my vessel at any given day.
Yeah.
And so but the inputs from that are varied. So even across a single owner, like one part of my fleet may be very highly instrumented, and another part may be a little older vessel, and I'm
Totally.
It's taking my staff time to get a holistic view of the status of the fleet.
Yeah.
On a day-to-day basis. And so looking at the data that's coming off of the vessel and being able to incorporate that into a long-term digitization strategy, that's the way a lot of the, I would say the really forward-thinking owners are behaving right now.
Yeah.
And that's been going on for a while, but it's still, there's still sort of a wait-and-see population, to be sure.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the same thing, and in many ways also, like, maybe one step further than that is like, yeah, how do you combine the different timescales involved for, say, like optimizing for profitability over, say, a year now, because that's the bookkeeping timescale of CII, versus like, a voyage level optimization. So how do you basically translate, a target you set for the year, which now involves CII, to, what should we be doing with the next voyage and the one after that? And how do we incorporate the uncertainty, not only if like the data we have today, which obviously, through noon reports and other sensor inaccuracies and potentially other sources of noise, now we also have to deal with the uncertainty, for the rest of the year. Because if we make a mistake now, or end up with a different fixture than we anticipated, and we're going to be spending more time in port, then that's going to basically, tank our CII potentially. How do we come up with a strategy that acknowledges the fact that a lot of that data and the models are uncertain? Like, we don't know what the day rate is going to be in 3 months from now, and we don't know what the bunker prices are going to do. We have to have a model. If we don't, then we're implicitly also making an assumption. So the challenges of like working across multiple timescales in terms of like optimizing for best sort of like economic outcomes, I think is something that comes on top of the fact that basically we have to deal with like heterogeneous data sets, like you just pointed out, like noon reports versus high frequency data, like, very different maybe vessel dynamics across the fleet. On top of that, basically now we have to figure out, okay, now we have to, where is this vessel going to operate geographically? How do we optimize for that in terms of like the overall CI score of our fleet? And those are challenges I think that all of us are just sort of like working on, like putting different tools together into like, how do we combine like objective optimization strategies with like, the level of uncertainty that we have in sort of like these forward models, and how do we, do it the right way, like not over-indexing on one specific part of this to only find that something else is actually the thing that drives the most or has the most impact on the outcomes. Like, what is the sensitivity to uncertainties in the system to the outcome for the year in this case, which is a new concept that basically now we have to not only optimize for a single voyage, but we have to look ahead, like how is that going to tie into like, the outcome at the end of the year. And in addition to that, there is the uncertainty around like, well, what should the outcome be, right? And what is the cost of B versus C score, and how much do I want to invest to make sure that it's going to be a B versus a C? And that's foundationally the question that I think everybody's like trying to understand and make assumptions on to basically figure out like what the best strategy is to implement it.
Wow, this is the multi-billion-dollar question in a way.
Yeah.
In a way, everybody's thinking about modeling. Everybody's thinking about forecasting and the impact of a voyage on the future outcome of the vessel to one degree or another right now. From our perspective, and it's part of the reason I'm sitting here today with you, Tim. From our perspective, is we realize that we can't be the best in the world at everything, and we need to be able to focus to be able to provide, our best answer in these models that we as a team sport are sort of putting together. we need to focus on where our strengths are and bring on and work with partners who have strengths in other areas of those in other variables that are inputs to those models.
Yeah.
So whether you are whether you're a 10 a 5 or 10 vessel fleet right now, and you're trying to figure out how do I just comply with doing some of this work in house, or whether you're hundreds of vessels and a charterer, and you have teams of people putting this together, like everyone is addressing this problem set, and it's not really uniquely competitive.
It isn't.
To be able to answer one,
Totally.
to get an answer there one way or another. So from my perspective, and I'm a little biased, to be honest, but like if I were going into sort of a make, buy, do it myself sort of decision to try to deal with all of this uncertainty, there are things as an owner or as an operator that I'm clearly the best in the world. I'm the best in the world at operating my own vessels.
Totally.
But there are other dimensions to that problem set that may be a little bit of outside of my my wheelhouse, my area of expertise, or my team's area of expertise. And so building building those complex models with the best information available to be able to reduce that uncertainty is a great strategy. If you have the pockets and the bench depth to do that on your own R&D, by all means, be thinking about it, be working on it. Just don't try to do it all yourself with what you have in house.
Absolutely.
If you're looking for a solution, look for somebody who is approaching that from a holistic perspective.
Yeah, find the right combination, right? I mean, to your point, like there are certain things that you should own. Like,
sure.
One, your data. I mean,
absolutely, no question.
I mean, in the end, that's where it all starts. I mean, after that, it becomes like, well, how do you store it? How do you report on it? And those are they're tools that can help you with that. And find the right balance. And same for optimization. That's not going to be something that there's not going to be somebody showing up and giving you like, here's the answer. It's going to be like, look, these are the information that we're trying to constrain as much as possible. You have that information. And so we need to work together to make sure that basically we're filtering through the right information to give the right answer. That's not going to be something that somebody can just hand deliver to you without sort of like working and integrating, thinking about workflows that are specific to your fleet to make that successful. And I think that's the reality with all of this. Like there's going to be so many different aspects involved in this. In CI, for instance, it's going to be contracting, commercial operators, fleet performance. It's not going to be one single group that can answer all of it because it requires lots of different types of data. And on the other side of it, like if you want to report, optimize, then basically that will also involve, probably interactions with, different groups of outsiders to help, get those outcomes you need. And that could be something that could be different for every company to like decide on like what should we own and what fraction of this should be look for outside help or tools to solve for it. So I this is something that we've seen every time. Like a lot of this, it's new, so we need to figure it out together. Like we can't like just sort of like, oh, we have we have the answer here. It's really about like, hey, what kind of data is there? Like, where are the uncertainties? How can we help identify those? How can we figure out like how to use the right data into like forward models and optimization? And that I think is actually a really exciting opportunity because we're all learning.
As we're sitting here describing this or talking about this, I can't help but we're sort of very excitedly focused on the first step on this journey, and that's sort of getting organized. And there are certainly groups of very smart individuals that are going to be able to come in and help an outfit optimize based on the information they have available. But they're going to have to start somewhere. So whether or not you go out and get an outside consultant to come in and provide you, obviously not all the answers, but a lot of good advice and some of those answers, they have to start somewhere. And that's where you're going to start, whether you're getting outside help or not.
Yeah.
You have to understand kind of
totally.
Where you are.
Any model is as good as the data you put into it.
Yeah, agreed.
That is a foundational thing, and I think that's sort of like what in the current stage. That's really the focus. Like, how do we make sure the data is there in a way that's accessible, shareable, and manageable? Like, if you want to run a model to do any sort of like optimization at all, then that model should have easy access to the information, and that's really, I think, one of the core initial challenges that we have to solve for, and we are solving for.
Yeah, agreed. even before you're starting with some of the really more expensive hardware solutions, changes to your vessel, those kind of things.
Kind of know to know what the investment actually did,
Yes,
right?
yeah. Or maybe you don't have to make it too soon. There's some trade-offs you can make for sure.
Yeah, cool. I think one of the last questions around like, urgency of implementation, something that we've gotten a lot, like, why now? Like, why not wait? Like, basically things will shake out, we'll get more information. We talked about it earlier, like, look, if you're starting thinking about now, you're probably behind. I mean, from my perspective, I think, this is the time to learn. Like there's lots of questions that we still have to figure out, like, what is the cost of CII? How do we optimize for it? This is an opportunity right now to learn how this is going to shake out. And if you know what it costs, like, how are you optimizing for it to make sure that you're hitting your targets in the most profitable way, which is not a trivial question. Like, doing objective voyage optimization is hard, objectively hard. But doing that in sort of like in the context of an annual optimization, it makes that, another order of magnitude more difficult. Can it be done? Yeah, from a technical perspective, it can totally be done. But usually the devil is in the details. It's around, like, how do you implement a workflow that actually works operationally? Like, theoretically, solving the problem is just one step. I mean, it's usually the easiest step. The more difficult step is, how do you make this actually work in an operational setting? And I think this year is going to be, and next year, and the coming years are going to be all about learning how to do that optimally. And if you start early, I think there is a real advantage, because, like we talked about earlier, like, we don't know exactly how this metric is going to flow down, like, over time. Like, there's going to be changes. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the current embodiment of it is not perfect, and wouldn't be reasonable to ask it to be. But the concept is not going to go away, and to optimize for it and to find out ways, like, not only measure, report, and operationally implement it, because that's what this is all about. That's going to be a challenge that's going to be persistent. And so the sooner you start with that, the sooner you're going to be able to successfully implement workflows that are going to sustain the best possible outcome. So I mean, that to me is it's an important thing that we discuss a lot, like, around, like, can we just wait? And I think the answer is yes, you can.
Sure.
You probably shouldn't.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I love about working in the maritime industry is mariners, owners, all very incredibly pragmatic people who pursue mastery in their own domain. I work with a lot of owners that have clearly forgotten more about how they run their business than I'm ever going to know about how they run their particular business, for sure. But the degree to which they apply that pragmatism and also that sense of entrepreneurism to the problem sets, they end up with organizations that from a distance look very similar, but as you get closer, the nuances of how things are managed at an operational level are very different. And there's a lot of great reasons for that. And those reasons make sense to those organizations. And so if you are waiting to get involved into a game that is continuing to evolve right now without your input in it, as the group that knows the most in the world about how you do business today, you're suffering a little bit from withholding, participating in that transformation.
Totally. Yeah. And the other flip side to that, like, flip side, I should say, but the fact that all of these companies are actually quite different when you look at a granular level, means that also, like, implementations of workflows and, like, how do you get the information in the right places is going to be something that's going to be somewhat custom. It's not going to be exactly the same for everyone. And so, again, like, thinking about that early is going to put you in a much better position to succeed, even at that level. Like, how do you operationally implement? So yeah, I fully agree.
Great. Yeah. The degree to which we can all take a step and see to which, where can we be flexible as we come together on this? If you love getting your daily email noon reports, but there's another way to get the data out as well that's a little more homogeneous and can be a little more streamlined, we'll happily work with you to help you get there. But just be a little bit open-minded as you're bringing in new tools to a part of your business that perhaps 2, 3, 5 years ago you weren't thinking. It just kind of worked the way it needed to. It met all of my needs. It's just quite the journey we're on right now.
It is. So if you step back, like, just as a closing sort of, like, thought, like, what do you see as sort of like the biggest challenge, and perhaps on the other side of it, the biggest opportunity, given sort of the context we're operating in right now, like the transition to one, the thinking around like, hey, emissions management is a thing to stay. Like reducing our carbon footprint is a thing to stay. CII is now there as sort of like the operational tool to help reduce emissions in operating vessels. Like, what do you see as like the challenge and opportunities, hopes and fears? Like, what is sort of like the top thing on your mind?
Well, I certainly don't know what the future of CII holds and can't predict what the regulations will be.
Yeah.
We watch that very closely, but we've seen enough changes that it would be dangerous for me to take a stake in that. What I can say is certainly some of the hard parts are the things that wouldn't be initially, it wouldn't come initially to mind maybe to an individual group, an individual owner, and it's about the vast spectrum of data that we're beginning to work with. So, and we've seen groups try to get groups of companies together and try to organize around a particular format, Noon report format, and put it into some JSON schema or something. And those things, those are great activities, and they're coming. And it's great to see people open to it. But the hard parts for us in a lot of those regards are really just some of the nuts and bolts. How do we take very widely unstructured information and put it, transform it into something that's repeatable and sort of means the same thing to everybody. And
so uniformizing, like creating uniformity in data.
Yeah, uniformity without another regulatory mandate. This is sort of a self-organizing.
Yeah, we should do this better.
yeah, we all agree we should do it better. And the degree to which you feel the pain from not doing it better depends on what you're trying to get out of it and sort of how forward-thinking you are. But that's certainly one of the areas where we see where we're putting a lot of work. So from the perspective of a tool maker, that's a consideration that drives our product roadmap. Another consideration that drives our product roadmap, for example, is the proliferation of low Earth orbit satellites and just constant connectivity and the availability that brings. So we're transitioning away from I have this periodicity of reporting that's maybe daily. To what you could begin to consider high frequency in the terms of minutes, and I can actually make changes operationally that can have real impacts for me economically because I just have a better idea of what's going on in the vessel. So those trends as well. That's another huge trend that's driving a lot of our consideration.
Data density and data uniformity.
Uniformity, density, and accessibility probably. So since we can get it back to people much more quickly. I speak with CIOs who are treating their vessels like they would treat an office building in the future. That's their goal.
Totally.
They would just they want to have everything on essentially on the cloud, and they're going to assume that it's continuously connected. And 5 years ago, that would have been, somebody would have thought you had 9 heads if you would have said that.
And building on that, that's sort of like what we see as I think an opportunity here is that with more data being available, with the mindset being becoming more prolific around we should think about how to model things, and which wasn't possible before. Without information, good luck modeling. Modeling is about propagating information forward and trying to figure out how to combine information or assumptions around what the information could look like in the future in a way that makes sense and tied to decisions. And that's something that this is the opportunity to do in terms of get more data, but also it's greater frequency, and it's going to be more accessible because it's going to be in a more uniform form or shape or format. That's going to open up a lot of opportunity in terms of improving our ability to predict forward with it, because that's something that I think we've always been hammering with. The quality of data has been questionable often, which makes it very difficult to analyze it and create, for say, a digital twin. Without that, you can't really predict forward what the vessel is going to do through different sea states, and in a longer time scale, you can't really figure out how the vessel is going to perform on an annual time scale either. And so, with greater data, I think the opportunity there is that we can actually translate that in helping models get better to where we can actually tie them to better decision making, create opportunities that way for companies to not only hit their goals of reducing their carbon footprint, but at the same time become more profitable rather than less. And I think that's a pretty exciting outcome if we can get both for it.
That's the best outcome. That's what we're all shooting for, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Paul. I think we're at the end of it.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Same here. Hey.